there's a difference between being brilliant and being perfect. And I think that so much of music education really drills down on this idea of perfection through repetition. And I just don't think that's how brilliance is created. Brilliance is created by saying, maybe get that good enough and then try something else, and then try something else, and then try something else.
It's so true, because how else does one find their voice? I just remember teaching same thing in MFA programs and people wanting the answer. And it's like, no, I write because I have so many questions.
Welcome to our first episode of Fellows in Conversation. Today, Hanif Abdurraqib and Jacqueline Woodson talk about the intersection of sound and language, exploring music, writing, and art. Hanif is a 2021 MacArthur Fellow, music critic, essayist, and poet, using the lens of popular music to examine the broader culture that produces and consumes it. Jacqueline is a 2020 MacArthur Fellow and writer, redefining children's and young adult literature to encompass more complex issues and reflect the lives of Black children, teenagers, and families. Let's listen to their conversation.
Hey.
Hey, honey.
Good to see you and talk to you again. This is, I feel like we're making a good habit out of this.
I know, twice in 1 year, at least twice in 1 year. I was in a Columbus this past week, and I was thinking of you. And I was like, I should holler at Hanif, but I was there for fencing nationals, so I was just
Fencing?
yeah,
No
my
way.
son's a fencer, so I mean, I know you know about what it means to be an athlete, and for me as the mom of an athlete, having I went to nationals, I did the whole nine in track, and then to grow up, have a kid, and watch how he gets coached, how he approaches it, it's kind of surreal.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, I grew up playing sports, and my brother grew up playing sports, and we
Mhm.
both played in college. And now my niece just signed like a Division I scholarship for basketball.
Wow.
You know what I mean? And so to watch that process, to watch my brother become a parent to a high level athlete after being a high level, it's bizarre.
Yeah.
It really it's delightful, but it's bizarre. I think
Mhm.
time. So much of my book and so much of my brain this year has been revolving around the passage of time, and
Mhm.
this has been, to watch my niece and my brother's daughter become
Mhm.
a basketball star and probably be the best athlete who has ever lived in our family. Um, it's fascinating. It's there's a sense of gratitude I feel, but
Mhm.
also the passage of time is really stark in that sense.
It's so true. I know I've sung the praises of There's Always This Year. And that's one thing that really stands out for me in the book is the melancholia. I think we share that in this way of being in the moment, but also being in the past moment and being able to see the future moment from both those moments. And that sense of kind of deep sadness and dread and celebration, and perspective all coming together. So for me, it's interesting to be in both those worlds and the real world of it and seeing it through your gaze and for me in Remember Us, which is about
Right.
basketball and a time before the WNBA. I find myself wanting to be that old lady preacher to kids. In my day, there wasn't even basketball for girls.
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna ask you, and I know that we're supposed to be veering towards sound, but I wanted to ask about time because I love Remember Us, not just for the basketball aspects of it, but because of the
Thank
kind
you.
of past facing narrative. And a lot of your books like tie together these narratives of a place before it was the place it is now, or a time before the time it was now. But Remember Us is unique to me because I was going through like old, before the WNBA, Columbus had like an ABL team. They had the Columbus Quest, which was like, that was the first basketball team I knew. It was our ABL women's basketball team. And I remember when the WNBA came, I felt so heartbroken in a way because it dissolved the Columbus Quest. All those players went to like Minnesota. They played for the Lynx. And I was thinking like, there's not going to be, as grateful as I am that I'm a massive W fan now, and as grateful as I am that the game is what it is. Um, it does feel to me that there was something in the time before the WNBA where, yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm saying I like that there were a lot of different outlets for women to play basketball semi-professionally, even though they weren't lucrative, even though they weren't on television, even though there weren't shoe deals. And I love remember us kind of for the moment of thinking back towards that era.
Both my aunts who one of them lives in Stewart, Ohio, but, grew up in Nelsonville and Columbus. Both of them played basketball, and they're in well, the one that's still living is in her 80s and talks about that time of women coming together and playing basketball, even in clubs. And somehow she played in high school, but it must have been just a team outside of high school, because I don't think she had one in her high school. But just knowing, I just can't imagine. I mean, she's very athletic still, but she has an oxygen tank and she's older. But just imagining what it was like for her as coming up playing ball. I know for me coming up, and we'll get to music. There was so much stigma around girls playing ball where I live. Like, you were a tomboy, you were a dyke,
Yeah.
all of these ways in which you didn't belong in the body that was the athletic body. Like, it was double dutch, which is super athletic, right? Is the sport you could do, but there was no competitive double dutch back then, like there is now. But even the emotional, the psychological limitation for women in the sport was something you had to push past in order to get good. And God forbid you walked onto, and remember us, Sage can beat all the guys.
Right.
But if you walked onto a court and you really had game like that, there was still a hazing, right? So, and then part of that hazing was like, oh man, you let a girl beat you at basketball. Like, so it's interesting to come through a different time where it's so celebratory. But I do remember early on in the WNBA when it was all about, your hair has to look nice, your makeup has to be on point, and you have to have this deep femininity.
Yeah, I remember. Gosh, I just watched a documentary on the women's USA team, like that great. I mean, they're all the women's USA teams are all great, but the one that was like Lisa Leslie and Dawn Staley. I mean, that really great one was in '96.
Yeah.
And they touched on that. They touched on this idea that a part of it's not even unspoken, like a spoken part of the contract of their presence on that team was that they had to also appear feminine. And, I remember Ruthie Bolton being like, well, that's, we're playing a game. Like, they don't ask the men to, look, look extra cleaned up or, at least not on the court, and that's, I think about that now. I mean, I'm thankful for how far the game has come, although I think the discourse around the WNBA, particularly this year, has been a bit grating. I have still enjoyed watching the games. I've just enjoyed watching the language and conversation around the game significantly less.
Oh man, that must be something for you. I think of you as, a musical genius, but also genius around language and interpretation of what people are truly saying. So I can imagine you watching this and just, I don't know, seeing between the lines and between those lines and between those lines. Hey, I have a question for you. I was thinking about this the other day when I was talking to someone, because I've talked about your book to everyone I meet. But you have this great essay in there on men getting left and the music around men getting left.
Oh, yes.
And the songs about getting left. And I can't remember, but there's one person who you don't believe. You talk about Otis Redding, and I love the way you talk about the songs that Otis Redding sings and how many levels there are to the pleading. And I think you go all the way to Boys to Men, right? Is it Boys to Men?
Oh, yeah, it's Boys to Men. Yeah.
But I was so curious. When I write, and we talked about this before, my headphones go on, the world goes away, the music that's in my ear is going to shape the narrative I create. So of course, Remember Us is all the music of the 70s. Um, and Jose Feliciano features big in there. But I was wondering about that essay and how the music. Do you write with music, and is it were did you have to go back and put the vinyl on and listen to those songs? Do you go vinyl, or how do you do it?
No, I mean, I do. I mean, I have like a vinyl record player in my office here, and I have like the records I'm listening to behind me. But I don't actually write to music at all. I can't do it. I edit to music, but I can't really write to music at all. It's something about like language in, language out, and now at this point, it's even
Mm,
sound in. Sound in, language out is a real hard thing for me. I think my brain just can't. It's because I grew up such a close listener. I grew up,
mhm,
and so if music is on, I think I'm attuned to it in a way that blocks out my ability to do much of anything else. You know, much of my listening is so highly concentrated that, of course, like we all, like I'm a runner, right? And so I'm coming off of a run, like literally I'm sitting here like right after a run. And when I'm on a run, it's a different thing. I could put on music and kind of just zone out. And the stuff, it's funny because the stuff I listen to while I'm on a run is stuff I probably wouldn't listen to if it's like, if I'm on a run and I'm listening to like Lil Baby or whatever, that's a different version of me than, the me who's trying to do like a close listen to some whatever else.
mhm, mhm,
Um, but when I'm writing now, I can't, I can't, now when I'm referencing something, I do have to go back. It's in that piece I talk about Otis Redding's version of My Girl, and
mhm,
I did have to go back and analyze that song to see if I'm remembering it correctly. Because a lot of the times I'm like, oh, I really love this song, but I love a version of it that has been present in a past self, or a past self has enjoyed this, even if that
mhm,
past self was like 3 days ago.
mhm,
And oftentimes, what I'm trying to do if I'm writing about music is, yes, analyze the song, but I'm also trying to convince a reader of something that they have not heard and don't have access to, but need to imagine, or to make it so enticing that they can go out or want to go out and find that song for themselves, that they want to pull up Spotify or whatever. But yeah, I mean, that's usually the process. I'm a really analytical listener, but when I'm writing, it's mostly to say, I want to do you the service of making this song seem irresistible to you, a reader.
mhm. Wow, that's so interesting because the music I listen to, I have one playlist that sometimes I add songs to it. I don't even hear the words anymore once I put it on because I've listened to the song so many times. I know exactly what they're saying. So it becomes more
Hmm.
about the rhythm for me that helps guide it. But yeah, most of the songs on it, I can recite every lyric. I can't sing because I can't sing, but and then the narrative, because for me music is so much about narrative, listening to the story inside the song, and the narrative is not present anymore. It's just what the music brings. I remember when I was working on Brown Girl Dreaming, when I was growing up, my uncle was incarcerated, and we would have to take what we call now the prison bus. So there was a bus that left Port Authority like every Saturday, one Saturday a month maybe, or I don't know, at like 5 a.m. And it was all black folks on it, black and brown, because that's who's been so impacted by the prison industrial complex. And I remember Love Train was a song that
Mm.
in my memory was always playing, like, and just being like this sleepy kid and waking up kind of hungry, and then there being food and everyone's passing around food because everyone's brought something, and this music and this kind of celebration on the bus, right? Because we're all going to see our loved ones, and but also this deep sadness. Like for me, the deep sadness of that moment being past, like never
Yeah.
having, or in
Yeah.
writing about it, knowing that that's something that's behind me. My uncle is no longer with us. My mother, my grandmother, everybody is gone from that moment, and all I have is this song and this memory of this song. And so when I sit down to write what I'm writing about, in talking about that moment as a present moment, right? In the narrative, I'm seeing it from this other place because I'm so far past it. But I can never hear Love Train and not go back to that. Like it's so deeply imprinted.
Yeah, I was gonna actually ask how you chose because I feel like I know I'm not imagining this. You also have like you touch on Earth, Wind, and Fire at
Yeah.
times in your work, and then Jose
Hmm.
Feliciano.
Hmm.
And the latter, Jose Feliciano's interesting to me because I remember being a kid. I came up in the era of cassettes and CDs, and
Hmm.
so I used to do this thing where I would listen to my oldest brother's rap albums and my sister's rap albums, and I would read the liner notes and then see what was sampled. And
Hmm.
then I would go down to my parents' record collections because they had massive record collections to see what was sampled. And I remember like the Jose Feliciano album Fireworks my dad had, and he had Romance in the Night, I think too. And I loved those records. I didn't listen to them until I was older, but I loved those
Hmm.
records. How do you decide on what musicians and what music populate your work? Especially because you are a memoirist, but like uh,
Hmm.
musicians and music populate your fiction. They populate your,
Hmm.
you know, the choices, the sonic choices that your characters make.
Hmm.
Is it important to you that they reflect the sonic choices and sonic pleasures that you experience?
That's such a great question. I think definitely there has to be a correlation. So it is all in conversation inside the narrative. So Jose Feliciano, for me as a kid, I was fascinated that he was a musician who was blind
Hmm.
and such a phenomenal musician, and he was also um, Spanish speaking. And I grew up in a Black and Latinx culture. So um, like groups like Santana and anyone who had some kind of um, Spanish speaking who was coming from like a Spanish speaking place or who had some kind of connection to any, Santo Domingo, Puerto Rico, Spain, any of that was very exciting for us because to us that was like, oh, they're like us. And then the fact on top of that that he was blind and that there was always someone who had met a musician, right? Because and so someone had met Jose Feliciano at one point, so that was another connection to our neighborhood, and our neighborhood. I mean, it's a very different neighborhood now, but our neighborhood was a working class poor neighborhood, so we just didn't have that kind of access to people and celebrity, but we had it through the mirrors of their music, and so in Remember Us, Jose Feliciano to me is connected to the whole idea of what we see and what we don't see and how we see it and what we do with that sight,
Hmm.
whether it's sight that's intuitive sight or sight that's actually visual sight. And then we have someone like Lisa who
Right.
is a character who has a glass eye and has is only has sight in one eye and also is very perceptive to what's going on around her and also very transparent. We learn that she has a glass eye that's too big because of the healthcare system
Right.
and the
Right.
fact
Right.
that they're like she'll grow into it and the kind of the heartbreakingness of that comes back to the heartbreakingness of when Sage talks about Jose Feliciano's voice. So I really think that even though early on in writing, I don't know how the strands are going to be threaded or braided together, but I know some part intuition, some part writer's muscle, that there is a connection between Jose Feliciano and the destruction of a neighborhood and a child who has a glass
Right.
eye, and the teller of the story who is seeing it all eventually.
Gosh,
So.
that's incredible. Yeah. It's interesting you said that. I mean, I grew up, my family, my parents are both from the East Coast. My mother grew up in
Mhm.
Queens and in Brooklyn, and my dad grew up in Brooklyn and New Jersey, which like defines much of my early musical childhood. My mother primarily did not listen to when I was young. She liked pop star. She liked Whitney Houston, and but she primarily listened to singers who were not singing in English. She loved Celia Cruz, she
Ah.
loved Miriam Makeba, and so most of the music I heard when I was young was in a language I didn't understand,
Wow.
and that was at least from my mother, and that was really interesting to me because like I love Miriam Makeba's voice. I love it so
Mhm.
much,
Mhm.
And it kind of tuned my ear to listen for sound more than to listen for, I didn't feel entitled. It adjusted my mind as a listener because I did not feel entitled to understand what I was hearing in order to enjoy it or in order to find pleasure in it. And Miriam Makeba is really important for me in that sense because she is someone who's so good with vocal melody and vocal, just like the manipulation of the voice to do a number of things. And it still hits me now, there is a way in my writing, I think, where I, as a music critic or as someone, I'm so against explanation. I'm just not that interested in explaining things to people.
Yes.
And I really do think it has something to do with the fact that when I was coming up, it wasn't, my mother understood the language she was taking in, but she didn't explain it to me. She would put on those songs and kind of be like, I like this song, and, the sonics of that song would be pleasing to me, and I didn't feel like I had to know what was happening linguistically to enjoy it. And I think that really did a lot for me as a kid. It did a lot for me to say, I can connect with this music. And of course, as I got older, I got curious and, did research and understood language better. But as a 5 to 7 year old, you're just kind of in the back seat of a car, taking in what you're taking in.
It's so true. So what language did your mom speak?
She spoke Spanish fluently, and she spoke Arabic very well. I actually was taught Arabic before I was taught English.
Wow.
Yeah, from ages, my mother taught us to write Arabic from ages 3 to 5 before I went to elementary school. And that all went out the window. School, the American education system, it definitely, of its many flaws, I think one flaw is that it can massage the instincts out of you that you kind of can learn in your home, I remember the first music class I took as a kid. I was like, this isn't the way I understand music. This isn't the way that my family taught me to understand music. And I need to cling to that because my parents were so committed to the question of what are you hearing? What about this music do you love? What are you understanding in this music? As opposed to just saying, how do you produce sound? And how does that sound benefit this classroom setting?
We'll rejoin our fellows in conversation with Hanif Abdurraqib and Jacqueline Woodson shortly. But first, if you're interested in learning more about MacArthur Fellows and their exceptional creativity, visit us at macfound.org. Now back to the conversation.
My son's about to go to this 2-week program at Oxford, and one of the things, and it's about the brain and psychology, it's neurology and psychology, and one of the things they give him a long list of stuff to read and watch, and one of them is Dr. Ken. I forget his name, but he does a TED Talk about education and how creativity isn't celebrated, and it gets unlearned really quickly in schools, and I just remember that being a writer and reader, and having learned to read through sound, right? Through my mom reading to me and me listening to albums and having to listen to things over and over and writing down the words and just having a very different journey toward understanding language. And then and growing up, because of the neighborhood I grew up in, I grew up speaking Spanish and English. And I took my daughter to my best friend Maria's grandmother's house, and now I'm in my 40s, and my daughter's lived, this was a long time ago, and so her grandmother asked me in Spanish, why does your daughter not speak Spanish? And I'm like, okay, yes, una morena, she's a black girl, and I turned to Maria and I was like, when did your grandmother stop speaking English? And she's like, she never spoke English. You always spoke to her in Spanish. And I had no memory of that. And I had moving out of that community, taking Spanish in school, where I feel like I unlearned so much more than I learned about it. And then that door kind of to that language closing, except for the Spanish. I speak like a 11-year-old Spanish, basically, because that's when I was fluent in it. But then looking at other countries where people are speaking 4 or 5 languages, and it's just the norm, and our monolingual language country just blows me away. And even my kids took Spanish for years and years and years. And can they speak Spanish? No, not so much. But
Yeah.
and then with music, I put both my kids in Suzuki music, for piano, which my daughter kept a couple of songs, but my son, who's an actual musician, was like, what is this ridiculousness? Like,
Right.
I'm
Right.
so
Yep.
far beyond like playing the same song over and over till I perfect it, and that this is just bullshit.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I struggled mightily with music education
hmm
because it does seem, this impulse of on perfection really strips away the potential for organic
hmm
one stumbling their way to a kind of brilliance. Stevie
hmm
Wonder, what I love about Stevie Wonder is that he's such a deeply imperfect player. He's a
hmm
very, I think he's an extremely perfect, um, arranger of songs. He's a pretty perfect writer. But when he's in process, he's perfect. But when he comes to play, if you ever see Stevie Wonder play, he's an imperfect player.
hmm
But he has laid a groundwork. The reason he has this dexterity in arranging and composing, he's like a brilliant composer in part because he is composing with a wide breadth of understanding of what his abilities are because he's not trying to hone down a kind of perfection.
hmm
And I never, when I think about this as with my craft as a writer, I don't have, I didn't I was bad in college. I was bad in school. I didn't study English at all.
hmm
I don't have an MFA. I don't have an interest
hmm
in one. I don't honestly, I joke about this, but it's kind of true. If I had to pass like a punctuation test on some shit where it's just like, where do you put a comma? I would probably fail that. But I think the embrace of those imperfections allows me to play. I remember the first time I realized I didn't have to put punctuation in nonfiction and actually removing the punctuation, realizing what it did for the sense of pace and urgency and tone.
hmm
And because I'm not beholden to these kind of ideas of what a perfect piece of writing can be, I think it allows me a wider range in which I can play. And I think about that with Stevie Wonder. I think about that
hmm
um, even to some degree with Prince. I mean, Prince's improvisational abilities, um, there's a difference between being brilliant and being perfect.
hmm
And I
hmm
think that so much of music education, and education broadly, but music education really drills down on this idea of perfection through repetition. And I just don't think that's how brilliance is created. Brilliance is
Yeah.
created by saying, maybe get that good enough and then try something else, and then try
hmm
something else, and then try
hmm
something else, and then stitch
hmm
all of those things together, and then maybe you have something
Yeah.
good.
It's so true because how else does one find their voice? I feel the same way. I'm always telling people to let it go. I don't have an MFA. I think it's a
Yeah.
great way for writers to make money by teaching, but I'd rather just get to the writing.
I thought you didn't have an MFA, but I didn't want to assume. But I thought we were the same in that way. I taught in an MFA program. I taught in a couple
hmm
just because on some visiting, and I'm always it's such an interesting setting for me. It's not a preferred setting for me because I do think that everyone is so used to perfection. And I remember one time I was teaching the poetry MFA, and a poet came to me in the workshop with a poem, um, and I was editing the poem, and I was like, "Oh wow, you got like three different poems in here," and the poet was just devastated. They were like, "Oh no!" Like, I was like, "No, no, no, no! That's thrilling. You know how hard it is to write one poem, and in this
hmm
one draft of a poem, you've somehow, you can extract so many things and have multiple poems if you just kind of." But it dawned on me that um, an abundance of ideas represents a kind of failure in that setting,
hmm
right? Because
hmm
it means you have not perhaps honed in, quote unquote, perfectly on the mission.
Yeah.
And an abundance of ideas represents more opportunity for, quote unquote, failure to say, I need
hmm
to go back. And for me, it's like, man, the more ideas I have, the more excitement I have in pursuit of them. And that doesn't mean that all of them are good, but
Yeah.
it means
Yeah.
that, I can pursue something and see what happens.
It's so true. People, when especially young people, ask me about, where do my ideas come from? And I'm like, I have more ideas than time. Like,
Yeah.
if you wake up in the morning, you have ideas. Like, so much is happening in your own head and in the world. But it is so true. I just remember teaching same thing in MFA programs, and people wanting the answer. And it's like, no, I
Yeah.
write because I have so many questions. Like, I am just here asking all these questions inside the narrative. I am not trying to answer anything, but and then the that false sense of a room of writers, right? I'm here all alone. Like, so that idea that you sit in a circle and you're all talking about your ideas and getting feedback from all these different people. It's like I show my work to two people, and the first time around, I'm like, tell me only what you love about this. That's all I
Yeah.
want to hear
Yeah.
at this
Yeah. Yeah.
embryonic stage, and then maybe next time you could ask me a question or two. But to sit in a room and get all that everybody else's ideas on your work, it just feels so false. And then this idea that we have the answer to how to do this, right? Like, we're going to come into this classroom and we're going to tell you how we do this. Half the time, I don't know how I do this. Like you said, I'm doing so many things at once. And eventually, all of those things lead to something that makes some kind of sense. But I'm sure the academics are out there picking it apart, saying Jacqueline Woodson did this because she meant this. It's like, I don't know if you say so. Like, I'll take your word for it.
Yeah. I often find it funny when I don't read much about myself, but when I do, and when I read like deep analysis of my work, and I'm often like, oh, sure, I guess, yeah, I'll take credit for that. I didn't mean to do it, but I'll take credit for it. But it's, so much of it is improvisation. I loved, I mean, no one freestyles anymore, really, in terms of rap. Everyone's kind of comes to the studio with their pre-written verses. But I remember growing up and watching Yo MTV Raps where people would really freestyle, and watching like Rap City when people would really freestyle. And I loved it. I loved it because it was messy and clumsy, and you could see people looking around the room trying to reach for the next bit of language, to find something to spark an idea. And that's kind of what the process could be for me. I think that's what the process is sometimes, where it's like I am really building planks in the bridge as I'm walking along it. And if I get far enough along that bridge and it's like, well, I can't turn back, I got to make something shake because I can't turn back. Turning back is a longer journey than getting to the end. And so I miss watching the art of freestyling as something that people took seriously as a way to be inventive in their articulation of a moment, and to maybe rhyme the same word twice, or maybe laugh their way through a line that doesn't rhyme, but you're chasing something, right? It's a bit more human, I think.
It's so true. And then also what I loved about those freestyle moments was it was still all love. And maybe this is my romanticized remembrance of it, because people were coming together and doing this thing and screwing it up sometimes and getting jibed for screwing it up, but not in a mean, like, cancel culture type way, or this way that like you need to just go home. Even the you need to just go home was part of the performance, and
right.
And the story they were telling, and it was just such a beautiful moment. And going back to that melancholy that we don't get anymore. And I love Kendrick, and I love the way he can rap with all this speed, and I think he is really brilliant in his execution. And at the same time, I think that it's so honed in this way that makes me long for that time where, a kid got up in the street with his Kango on and just spit those lyrics and went home and, wrote it on the back of a, composition notebook. But, it just felt so much more organic at the time. Even someone like Young Ma, I think I like.
I love her. Yeah,
because she harkens to a time that I remember from my early days of listening to rap. Also, there's so much rap. I feel like now that my poor son, who listens to all kinds of music, I'm like, but Jackson, I don't understand what they're saying. And I remember not understanding people back in the day because they had that their words weren't so crisp sometimes, but eventually it settled in. I'm like, oh yeah, that's what they were saying. So it took a beat to digest it, but eventually I got it. And now I'm just like, no, I don't really get what they're saying. I don't get it.
Yeah, I
So
think there are people who imagine. I mean, I grew up with like, I grew up with like Bone Thugs and Harmony, which, but their kind of post language approach was really in service of harmony, like in service of sound. It was in a way, like certainly they were rapping in English, but it was in a way the same way I felt listening to say Miriam Makeba, where it was like the language is almost secondary to the capturing of a melody. I don't know now. I think there is a somewhat post-language thing happening in rap music that is not in service of sound in that way. It's in service of, I'm not entirely sure what it's in service of, but it's sometimes in service of the production, or it's sometimes in service of, just the thematic approach, but it doesn't really serve the songs for me in the same way. And so I struggle with that. I mean, there's a way that I value clarity. Like I value, either I value clarity or I value a lack of clarity that is serving sound in a very specific way.
that makes so much sense.
And I think that there's a lot of rappers who are in that middle ground who are not very clear, but are also not serving sound.
It is so true. So who are some of your favorites these days?
I like Tierra Whack because
Yeah.
she's just so strange. Like I think I'm drawn to strangeness. I think I've always maybe growing up. I think I liked strange. I liked Busta Rhymes because he was strange. But I love Tierra Whack. I really love. There's a rapper named Vel 9 who 2 years ago came out with an album that I think was my favorite rap album of the year.
I don't know them.
Yeah, I mean, she's like. I always thought she would get bigger, but I think, it just hasn't happened. There's a rapper I like named Unruly who's from Virginia, and he reminds me of like AZ. I loved AZ growing up. I loved his voice, and Unruly reminds me of him. I do like Kendrick. I've gotten, I feel like this is maybe blasphemous, but I feel like the Not Like Us victory lap for me has gotten a bit exhausting. I've seen it, I've heard it. I just, I don't. I don't need much more of it. I really, I like all the Griselda dudes. I mean, I can only listen to, after a while for me, and this is how I feel like I'm aging, I can only listen to like drug dealing metaphors that aren't stitched into like a narrative. I love, I don't mind drug dealing raps, but I think a narrative, if there's a narrative there, if there's like the hustler, to take, for example, and I'm not much of a Jay-Z guy now, but like Reasonable Doubt is such a great album to me because it's like there's a narrative attached to it. It's like the hustler trying to make good. Even to do this in a more recent sense, that one Pusha T album, Darkest Before Dawn, there was a narrative attached to that. It was like there's a hustler who's attempting to make good. I can, if there's not that and it's just a bunch of metaphors about cocaine and, it's like, I get it, but I do like Benny the Butcher. I do like those guys. But I'm always, who are your favorites? My ear is always to trying to find new folks.
I can't, Tierra Whack is at the top of my list always.
Yeah.
And, to everyone's dismay, I still like Kanye. So
Yeah.
I think I like what he does in the side of music. I think there's a fearlessness to it. And I think that every time, my son's the DJ whenever we're in the car, I don't always know who's playing. And he will, and when I hear a song I absolutely love, I'm like, who's that? He's like, that's Kanye. So I feel like I think going back to talking about that student in the poem, I feel like there are a lot of stories happening inside one song of his. And, oh goodness, I can't, I'm gonna blank on many other people, but so I don't know.
I was thinking about Kanye recently. Like I haven't listened to more of the recent stuff, but I remember hearing, there are albums in my life, they're like a handful where I truly remember every single thing about where I was when I heard him for the first time. And I remember hearing Dark Twisted Fantasy for the first time because I was in a car, I was driving to somewhere inconsequential, like not even far. I was driving like from my house to a friend's house in Columbus. And I remember being so struck by just the first two songs that I pulled over and
Oh,
listened to the whole
wow.
album. I like listened to the whole album on the side, and that album's not short. I mean, I listened to that whole album just like on the side
Oh,
of a road in Columbus. And gosh, the ambition. There is a sense of there's a sense of fearlessness in some black musicians that I
hmm
think can be traced a long way back. I think about Alice Coltrane had that kind of fearlessness, and
hmm
Prince absolutely had that kind
yeah,
of
yeah,
fearlessness.
yeah.
And it's like being unafraid to fail because even your failures are maybe, I
hmm
remember reading reviews of Prince's mid late career work, like 90s,
hmm
early mid
hmm
2000s stuff. And all the reviews said the same things. Where it's like, well, this isn't a great Prince album, but
hmm
there's still stuff on here that no one else in the world can do, you know?
hmm
And
hmm
I felt, and I do think Dark Twisted Fantasy is a great album, a singular album. I think maybe one of the best produced rap albums of my
Yes,
life,
it was so
of any
well produced.
life. Um, but
It's
even if something like Yeezus, which I'm fine with, I think it's all right.
hmm
I remember
yeah, I
listening to
don't
that
know.
and being like, I think this album's okay, but there's stuff on here that no one else in the world could have
hmm hmm
done, you know?
Yeah,
And I think that takes a level of fearlessness, and that takes a
yeah.
level of not being, I don't know. I sometimes wish I had that, and that kind of, I think the ambition is there in my own work, but I do think that I sometimes trip over my own anxieties.
It's so funny because I don't think of you as fearless, but I do think so. Your work does have like, I said what I said, which is a kind of fearlessness,
Yeah.
and going back to just that not explaining there's that beautiful I think it's early on in the book where your father takes y'all to watch the airplanes
Yeah.
take off, and you trace it back to him you know moving from Jersey, and all of y'all ending up in Ohio and all of that. And there is this way that you approach that beauty that is fearless. I think it is like, I don't care if no one gets this, and I'm not going to explain it, but this is what it is. And either you're here with me or you're not. Like, and if you're not, this is not for you. So which I think is so much, is fearless rather than trying to fit something into a box so many people can understand. I think of Whitney Houston and like
Mm,
being younger and listening to her, and her voice wanted to be fearless, right? There was a fearlessness to her instrument. And then watching the way she negotiated there were times where it's like, well, she's going somewhere, right? She's taken off and doing something. She's going to do something really different, and then watching that get snatched back, and then following the whole backstory of sexuality and her family, and like the way that it felt silenced and tamped down, and then slowly watching her disappear inside of it,
yeah.
and that that
Gosh.
that all of that potential to be something even more amazing than her instrument got erased, and then she was
Mm,
gone. So for me it just feels like, why not have that fearlessness? Because what else is there, right? What is the alternative to not being able to do the thing you want to do 100%? I think about that a lot because I think a lot of young people profess a fearlessness. They get on social media and
right.
they're like doing all this stuff, and
Yeah.
inside it I just see so much fear,
Right.
right? Such a deep sense of unbelonging, or a deep sense of failure, or a deep sense of potential failure. So let me scrim this in fabulosity.
Mm,
And then I've made the mistake of working with a couple of people who were very visible on social media, and then seeing the lack of there, because that's what, if someone's on social media all the time, just all the time, like putting this and putting that and doing it for the camera, it's like, what's happening back
what's happening
here?
behind the scenes? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 So
How do you maintain a, a still really rigorous and thoughtful and urgent level of fearlessness into, like, obviously you're not, It's not like you're 100 years old, but your career
I'm,
though.
I'm
But
old, and my career is
your
30
career
years
is
old.
like older than, you know what I mean, older than a lot of people's
Yeah,
careers.
yeah, it was
Um,
back in the 90s, which feels like yesterday.
and
Um,
and you've seen, and not only is your career like tenured, but you're one of those rare writers who's had success in like every decade you've worked, you know, and you've had success in various like wide range of forms and modes in every decade. And I think it would be easy to like, I don't know if this would be easy, but I think for a lot of writers, it'd be easy to say, I, I don't really need to try anything new. I don't need to take any new risks. I've done everything I
mhm,
need. You know, how do you
mhm.
maintain this level of fearlessness with this level of tenure?
I don't ever want to be bored. That's my thing, right? Yeah, that's why I don't write series. That's why I'm, writing for children and adults and plays and articles and interviews. Like, I just, my mind is always going. And I think that if I always think of that Joni Mitchell song when her album Live. I forgot which one. I think it might be Blue, but she's talking about circle game, how people always asking her
Mm.
to sing circle game, and she's like, no one ever asked Van Gogh to paint a starry night again. And so for me, I never want to paint a starry night again, right? I've done it. I've seen that I could do that, and that ended up being whatever it was going to be. So what's next? Even with awards, like until Zoom, like when I had awards up and stuff, they were always on the wall behind me because I didn't want to look at them. I'm looking at a picture of my family. Like, that has nothing to do with what
Yeah.
I want to do. And I think that keeps me humble. I mean, my kids keep me humble. I know when I got the MacArthur,
Oh yeah, I
I was
remember you told that
always
story.
like, yeah, it's like, you can't even do remedial math. And it's like, no. So, but I do think that I really want to, there's so much I want to do that I feel like I feel like middle grade books, that was what I started out doing, and I'm at the end of that. I'm gonna write one more, I'm done. Like, I've told the story I want to tell in that genre. But it really is the excitement of the fact that languages feel so infinite to me, and story feels so infinite to me, and the world is, even though I write about Brooklyn a lot, like, I can write about Brooklyn in the 90s and it's very different than
Hmm.
it was in the 70s. I was thinking about that with Ohio.
Yeah.
I mean, this time when I was there, I stayed in Short North. I stayed in that Wonder Bread loft, and I could not get my bearings. Like, I'm like, I don't know where I am here because the architecture has changed so much, and even the people. I saw so few black people. I was like, where my people
Yeah.
at?
Yeah. Yeah.
So and having gone there all my life from the time I was 12 or 13, and just getting to that point where I'm like, I'm lost in the city I was born in, felt
Mm.
really kind of surreal. And writing it down, like writing Another Brooklyn, the opening of that says, for Bushwick in memory, because the neighborhood has changed so much, and wanting to know that we were there and this is what it looked like, and you didn't discover this neighborhood, you Columbused it, right?
Right.
Like, you came
Right.
here and said it was yours, and said that you had discovered it, but there were black and brown people in that space before the Columbusing people got there, and going to Columbus, the city, and seeing that. I think, I don't know if I'm going to ever write about it, but just thinking, wow, how does it feel? What does it mean to be lost at home?
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's so disconcerting to me.
It is. I mean, I experience that. I experience that often now and I live here. I mean, I truly live
Hmm.
here, and I mean, I live in Bronx. You know, I live in like one of the last historically black neighborhoods, so I see black folks because this is what the neighborhood is. This
Hmm.
neighborhood is also a little bit, because of its historical nature, it's a little bit harder to gentrify, though they are trying.
Hmm. Hmm.
But when I go into, say, the Short North, I'm always like, this is like a city within a city, and it's a city
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
understand.
Hmm.
And I'm often asking myself the question of what happens when a bunch of smaller, indistinguishable cities get built inside of this distinguishable city I love.
Hmm.
At what point do those small cities overtake the larger city? And then I don't have a place, or the place I have is confined to this neighborhood I love. And every time I go outside of it, I feel like I'm relearning, or I'm forced to relearn this place I love. And that, in a way, keeps me ambitious, but also keeps me humble. It's also funny what you said about awards, because I notoriously don't know like where awards are. I don't, I just like when I joked about this, but it actually happened. I didn't know where my National Book Award medal was for after I got one for like 3 weeks. And then I did laundry one day and I heard this like loud sound in the dryer. This like really, and I was like, what the fuck is happening? And I opened the dryer and I had just like somehow had the medal in the dryer, So it's like, and of course I'm grateful for those things. I'm grateful for acknowledgement, but I think the material recognition of them, if I spent too much time looking at them and marveling at them, it would make me feel like I have done my work already, or I've done my best work already. And that's much like to live in a city that is constantly telling me that it is going to transform no matter what I create about it, or no matter how lovingly I write about it. That tells me that my work is also not done in terms of archiving this place that will soon not look like any place that is recognizable to me.
Yeah, it's so true. How do you deal with like, do you get recognized when you go out in the street?
Yeah. It used to only happen. It actually used to only happen, not only, but it mostly happened in Columbus. But now it happens it happens pretty much everywhere. But the tone of it in Columbus is different. The tone of it, because these are my neighbors in a way. I've lived here my whole life. These people, most of them have seen me in different capacities. So in Columbus, it's a little bit less like, it's someone maybe being like, I got your new book, I love your work, but it's also more conversation based. It's more like, we're talking about sports or music, and it's a little less, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not used to that. I'm a bit of a reclusive by nature. I'm reclusive. And I just know that my brain and heart require me to be in the world, because otherwise I think it would be, I wouldn't realize it, but it would be detrimental to my brain, I wouldn't realize it until it was like too late. Yeah. If I were just like, I could be in my house for 2 weeks at a time without seeing or talking to a person, and I would feel fine, but my brain would just be kind of like eating itself without my knowing it. So I really love it. I know we're up against time, but you surely get recognized in the world, right? I feel like you're like,
more and more. But I can walk out into the world and disappear very easily. I think when I change my hair a lot, but also there is definitely an invisibility that I actually kind of like. Like, I can't imagine having to walk through the world and be known in that way. But I think my favorite recognition was the TSA guy. I was getting on the plane, and there was this older Black guy, and he looked at me, he looked at my license, and he's like, you are you that Jacqueline Woodson? And I was like, oh my God, this is my, and then another time I was at Cousin John's, the bakery, and this older Black woman's like, it's you, isn't it? That's you. And I was like, yeah, I'm me. And she's like, I love your music. People, John Baptiste. I told you that was John Baptiste. I'm not John Baptiste.
Wait, she thought you were John Baptiste?
Like 3 shades lighter. I mean, like, the whole. Yeah.
I mean, I adore John. He seems like an absolutely wonderful dude. Have you seen? Speaking of John, I watched. What was the name of that documentary? Have you seen American Symphony?
I have not.
It's such a beautiful process. Like, I love anything that shows me an artist in process. I kind of love organically, but that is maybe one of the most beautiful process pieces I've seen in a long time.
Oh, okay, I'm gonna watch. He's a neighbor. He and Celia live here in Brooklyn, like so many other people, and I've been planning to watch it, to talk to him about it, and have not. But now that you co-sign on it, I'm there.
But it is funny that someone believed you were John.
I think a piece had just come out about him living in Brooklyn, and she was so thrilled. I should have played along and let her think she had met him. Take a picture with.
To learn more about Hanif Abdurraqib's work, visit abdurraqib.com. To learn more about Jacqueline Woodson's work, visit jacquelinewoodson.com. The MacArthur Fellows Program identifies and supports extraordinarily creative individuals with a track record of excellence who demonstrate the ability to impact society in significant and beneficial ways. To learn more and listen to music from the artists featured in this conversation in our Spotify playlist, visit us at macfound.org.